Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on March 14th, 2025. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is an American political activist. In 2016, he was the Green Party nominee for Vice President of the United States on the ballot in 45 states and received nearly 1.5 million votes. He currently serves as the national organizer and spokesperson for the Black Alliance for Peace. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jamu.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you have been dedicated to the cause of peace for a very long time, and you participated at the highest level in the U.S. electoral process. You've been a tireless critic of U.S. Imperialistic foreign policies. And in short, I can't think of anyone who's better qualified than you to weigh in on a question that is preoccupying many of us. Donald Trump began his second administration by declaring that he wanted to be remembered as a peacemaker. He and his foreign policy team have stated repeatedly that they want, in particular, to bring an end to the Ukraine war. And their rhetoric at least seems serious. For example, they've acknowledged that Ukraine can't win the war and that must make territorial concessions for there to be a peace deal. They've also acknowledged that this is a proxy war. Now, today, Presidents Putin and Trump spoke hours ago about ending the war. And after the call, Trump posted on social media the following comments. We had a very good and productive discussion with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there's a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. I've strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one not seen since World War II. God bless them all. Now, Ajamu, at the same time, after a brief purported pause in the provision of weapons and battlefield intelligence to Ukraine's military, the Trump administration just agreed to resume the arming of Ukraine and to resume the provision of battlefield intelligence to its military. And we're told that the administration agreed to do this simply because Ukraine is willing to enter into a 30-day ceasefire. But as the administration surely knows, Russia's government doesn't appear to have much interest in a ceasefire unless what it regards as the underlying causes of the war are dealt with. So what do you make of all of this? Do you think the Trump administration is serious about ending the war in Ukraine? Or is this just, appealing to that part of Trump's base which wants to see an end to the war? And if you think it is serious, my next question to you is, do you think it has the competence and the sophistication to bring this war to an end?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. First, I do think that they are in fact serious. Will this result in a ceasefire over the next few days? I doubt it. I think that the Trump statement was a statement that was geared to provide him some degree of political cover, knowing that basically they have not been able to and will not work out the terms of a ceasefire until some of those fundamental issues that the Russian Federation raises are addressed. In the meantime, that means that the military action to push the Ukrainian soldiers out of Russian territory will probably continue with, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the continued loss of life. So I see this more as a political cover than anything else. On the second point, do they have the sophistication? Of course they do. Of course, many people would not agree with that because they suggested that the Trump administration had basically given up all their cards as Trump using his communication with Zelensky. But what I think they indicated, what they signaled, was that they were not going to play games with attempting to try to win through negotiations what was not reflective in the reality on the ground. That basically, as a consequence of the decision made in March, April of 2022, to continue with the conflict and to basically abandon the peace process in Istanbul, the result has been that the Ukrainians have lost a third of their country. And the Russians seem to have concluded, I think quite understandably, that as a consequence of the blood and steel expended, that they're not going to give up those territories. They're going to continue to provide some degree of coverage or protection for the ethnic Russians in that area, and that therefore any discussion around them departing from that territory is a non-starter. So, I think they laid out those terms as a beginning point to have a serious conversation to get to what the Russian Federation refers to as the root causes. And that, of course, generated a lot of anger because you have many of the European leaders who are engaged now in magical thinking, and you have some elements in the foreign policy elite in the U.S. That would like to have a different outcome. They wanted to, in fact, impose a quote unquote strategic defeat on the Russians. That's not going to happen. And in fact, the strategic defeat is on the other side. So they are quite upset with this outcome. But as Trump has indicated, he comes almost with he comes almost as an innocent, if you will, because he does not relate to or embrace the fact that the war started from the very beginning, and therefore he has no skin in the game in terms of how it's going to end.
Mhm. So, in response to this ceasefire proposal, well, and I should add that when the Trump administration announced that they had convinced Zelensky's regime to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, they and just about every Western leader across Europe and Canada immediately in unison said the ball is in Russia's court. So yesterday, President Putin responded formally and in detail to this ceasefire proposal. And he did so by, first of all, expressing the general desire of his government to bring the hostilities to an end. But then he went on to say that there are a number of issues that haven't been resolved. And he asked some quite pointed questions about this proposal. I'll just mention a few of them. Quote, how will issues be resolved along the entire line of engagement that is almost 2,000 kilometers long? Then he asked, who will determine where and who has violated a potential ceasefire agreement? Then, if we cease combat operations for 30 days, what does this mean? That all those located there will be withdrawing without battles? That we have to let them free after they have committed a great many crimes against civilians? Or will the Ukrainian leadership give them a command to lay down their arms and simply surrender? And finally, he asked, how will these 30 days be used for the purpose of continuing forced mobilization in Ukraine, for the purpose of supplying weapons there, and on and on. Now, some people in the corporate Western media immediately jumped. They seized upon the first part of his answer, which was an expression of a desire to bring the hostilities to an end, and said that he'd accepted the proposal. How do you read this response? Do you read it as an acceptance of the 30-day ceasefire proposal? And if not, what do you think Putin is trying to communicate here?
No, it was not an acceptance. It was consistent with what the Russian Federation has been articulating from the very beginning, that they're always open to diplomacy, a peaceful, if you will, resolution of the conflict. So they have been quite consistent. So he embraced, he unified, if you will, with that desire being articulated by the U.S. administration. But what he did do, and the other points, was to reveal the complexities of a ceasefire. And not only did he do that to help people to understand how complex that really is, but basically he laid out a map in terms of why there will not be a ceasefire in the immediate future as they wrap up the incursion into Russian territory. And so he has given himself, if you will, some degree of political cover to continue with that military offensive, counteroffensive, while these very real points are being discussed as part of a process potentially leading to a ceasefire. But understand this: even with those most technical elements that have to be discussed, He still, and they have not seemed to alter their position. Therefore, a ceasefire to be entered into, there has to be a clear indication that some of those root causes are going to be resolved, including Ukrainian neutrality, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, the notion that the Trump administration has that they're going to come in and end this war on the first day was just a reflection of either naivete or that Trump really is a psychopath. This is a very complex situation, and I think that those points that Putin made yesterday reflects how complex this process really is.
Mhm. Now, I'd like to talk to you about a related subject, and that is U.S. military spending. Uh, the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, directed the Pentagon in early February to come up with a plan to cut U.S. military spending by 8% per year for 5 years. So, in aggregate, that would be a 40% reduction in military spending. Just unprecedented in my lifetime that anybody's even proposed anything like this. Now, at around the same time, congressional Republicans started pushing for at least 100 billion in additional defense spending during the next decade to boost the military's budget and, as they put it, advance President Trump's agenda. So, again, Ajamu, what is going on here? Based on what you've seen thus far, do you believe the administration is serious about cuts in military spending? And if so, what do you think they're trying to cut? Do you think they're just going to, a la Elon Musk, try to reduce the vast military bureaucracy, but maintain weapons programs, maintain these over 800 foreign military bases? Or do you think they're serious about shrinking the size of the actual physical size of the military?
I think it is a very interesting discussion and one that has put on the table forever and can't be taken back the question of military spending and the possibility of that spending being cut. And that is a good thing. What that might mean in reality remains to be seen. What it suggests is two things. One, that of course, because of the orientation of these oligarchs, when they talk about reducing spending, the first target is always labor. So it will be a reduction in the personnel who make up the Defense Department and its corresponding industries. Secondly, though, it suggests a coming out of the Ukrainian conflict, it suggests a reevaluation on the part of many on what it really takes to have a modern and lethal military force in today's reality. What you have with drone reality, cyber conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And the conclusion, I think, was sort of indicated even under the Obama administration, and that is a revamping of the military, one that is more concerned with special forces, special counter insurgency, and counterterrorism forces, and actually a reduction in in military personnel, but simultaneously a more focused and lethal kind of military. So there is a possibility that that is leading some of the considerations. I think is a very real possibility. So there is that commitment, and along with that, of course, would be to decide how many of those 800 to 1,000 military bases can be closed without undermining the ability of the U.S. to engage in a global military reach. So I think there is an indication of that is going to be on the table. Why? Well, not only because it might make a more effective military sense, but people have to understand the U.S. is in a precarious situation economically. You're talking about a $37 trillion debt. Austerity was going to be on the table no matter who sat in the white people's house in 2025. That basically this was part of the program. And what they want is austerity, with also protecting the Trump Obama, if you will, the Trump Obama tax cuts. Okay, so this is their attempt to try to do that. They recognize they have to cut across the board, and so that I think is what is driving some of these forces. The last quick thing on this: some of these proposals also, though, indicate the unresolved internal struggles taking place among the ruling elements in the U.S. The different sectors of capital that in the past, those conflicts of interest were usually dealt with in the executive, and decisions were made and adhered to that were seen to be in the best interest of capital as a whole. Because of the severe antagonisms now among the ruling elements, that is not taking place in the same way. And so you have these different sectors vying among themselves for influence. Different powerful sectors: finance, capital, the military industrial complex, the energy companies. And so this is being reflected in the general disarray, which is reflected of the general crisis of the ruling elements in the U.S. That then gets manifested in these contradictory policies that are being floated.
Well, let us hope that divided they fall. And,
That's my position. I say go Trump, go, in terms of attempting for the Europeans to attempt to try to go at it alone in Ukraine, the trade wars, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that I didn't dream would be coming from the ruling elements. This is part of the agenda that we were supposed to have in terms of sharpening the contradictions among the ruling elements. But Trump is definitely doing a lot of our work for us.
right. Your comments about the effectiveness of the current military reminded me of the aircraft carriers that fled the Red Sea after taking on what was effectively an insurgent force over the last 16 months of genocide. These extraordinarily expensive, I mean, the cost of these things is mind boggling. Not being able to put a stop to the attacks of Ansar Allah on Red Sea shipping was, I would have thought, would introduce quite an element of alarm into military thinking in the United States. But since I've now raised the subject of West Asia, I'd like to go to the question of Palestine with you, Ajamu. And one day, on the day before Trump returned to the White House, or the White People's House, as you quite rightly call it, Israel finally agreed to a ceasefire, as we all know. And at that point, one could have argued credibly that the second Trump administration was trying to bring the genocide to an end. But things have evolved since then, and not in a good way. At no time did Israel permit the entry into Gaza of the amount of humanitarian aid that it had agreed to allow in under that ceasefire agreement. And moreover, after Hamas refused to agree that Israel could remain in the Philadelphia corridor, which it was supposed to begin withdrawing from at the end of the first phase, Israel imposed a total blockade of food, water, medicine, and electricity on Gaza in flagrant violation of international law. And since the ceasefire began, Israel has killed well over 100 Palestinians in Gaza. Just today, Israel's military killed 2 children in 2 separate drone strikes in Gaza. And meanwhile, the Trump administration vowed to clean out the Palestinians in Gaza, as they put it, which would unquestionably constitute a crime against humanity. And despite Israel's violations of the ceasefire agreement, it has delivered more weapons to Israel, including, I understand, large numbers of 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. At this stage, Ajamu, do you see any meaningful difference between the approach of the Trump administration to the genocide in Gaza and the approach of the Biden administration, or do you think there's clearly a continuity of agenda here?
There's definitely a continuity of the agenda. The only difference is that the Trump forces are more honest than the Biden forces. Both have the same positions in terms of providing Israel an opportunity for a final solution for Palestinians. Of course, the Biden administration would not be as unsophisticated as the Trump forces to suggest that they're going to cleanse the Gaza and then erect a Mediterranean Riviera. But that's just a manifestation of the kind of colonial crudeness that the Trump forces represent. but it does suggest that there is um, 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 unity among these elements, these ruling elements, on the commitment to have a final solution that could end up with the Gaza and even the West Bank being cleansed, if you will, of Palestinians. Look, if that wasn't the case, I know some people may already be thinking if there was a difference. If that wasn't the case, then the Biden administration would have been much more forceful in enforcing some of their own determined red lines, including the red line of not going into Rafah. But it was those red lines appeared to be more PR than anything else. It wasn't a case of the Netanyahu government being able to manipulate and bully the Biden folks. They did that, of course, because they have tremendous support within the U.S. And I'm going to make a point about that in a second. But the Biden folks were primarily supportive of the need in their minds to eliminate the threat to Israel, which meant undermining the military capacity of the Palestinian resistance. And they were prepared to go all the way. As long as the most significant opposition that could have been mounted within the U.S. coming from liberal left elements were somewhat domesticated, if you will, because of Biden being the one helping to execute this strategy. As Netanyahu forces correctly, probably identified, they had a historic possibility, opportunity to basically realize what they've been talking about for decades in terms of a final solution for Palestine, and they moved on that. So, a continuity, yes. Reflective of the power of the Zionist lobby, also yes. Now, the element I wanted to just touch on too is the fact that one element people don't talk about, and I don't, and this might sound conspiratorial, but it really isn't, in my estimation. The dumping of Biden, the coup that was executed in the Democrat Party. Uh, One of the factors people don't talk about is just a little bit of resistance that the Biden folks mounted to try to keep some degree of influence, if you will, on the Netanyahu forces to not be as aggressive because they recognized at one point that it was undermining not only the long-term interests of Israel, but definitely undermining the long-term interests of the U.S. Just in terms of trying to exercise their power with this vassal state, or supposedly vassal state, and pausing the transfer of military supplies to Israel, the Zionist elements went crazy. And I think as a consequence of that little bit of resistance, it lasted about 4 days. And it's starting to come out now. There was an agreement. There was a recognition that Biden had to go. There was already concern about him not being able to win, but that was one of the elements that has to be considered in explaining how quickly and effectively that they were able to garner their forces and execute successfully that internal coup within the Democrat Party. So yes, consistent, yes. Um, and unfortunately for the U.S., basically it is a failed strategy because there could be no normalized relations in West Asia with the track that they're on now. Even though we know that a number of these monarchs and corrupt governments in West Asia really couldn't give a damn less about the Palestinians. The fact of the matter is that there's significant concerns among the populations, and therefore having to, being openly supportive of this genocide is something that would destabilize their own populations, and that's why there have been somewhat of constraint on the final solution being executed.
Mhm. So, since you raised the election and Biden and how his dealings with Israel might have affected his ultimate fate, since Trump came to office and has demonstrated this continuity of agenda. Some It's probably more than some. It's quite a few supporters of the Democrats have taken to social media to lambaste people who support the Palestinian cause but who refuse to support Kamala Harris. And it's their basic premise is what you got is even worse. What is your take on that, Ajamu? Do you think people were correct as a practical matter, as a matter of conscience, to refrain from supporting Kamala Harris because of the genocide? Or do you think they should have held their nose and voted for her nonetheless?
I think that any person who calls themselves a progressive, any person who might define themselves as someone who supports human rights, anyone who believes in the equality of all human beings, there's no way that you could give your vote to a candidate that was openly in support of the continuation of the genocidal policies in Gaza, meaning that there was no way one could give their vote to either one of those two criminal political parties. So this notion that what we see with the Trump administration is worse than what would happen under Harris is nonsense. The only thing that would have happened differently would have been a slight change in some of the rhetoric. There's no, and has never been a real commitment to anything called a two-state solution. That was always BS. Okay, so but you would have heard more of that under the Harris administration, while they were still allowing the Israelis to root out the military capacity of the Palestinian resistance. So no, there wouldn't have been any change. It would have been sugar-coated somewhat. They may have put some degree of pressure on the Israelis when it became clear that the entire global population was turning against them. But it still would have been hell on the part of the hellacious results that we see the Palestinians are suffering through under a Harris administration also.
Mhm. So let's move a little bit to the east and talk about what's going on in Syria. This is a subject you've been vocal about as well. And, during the past few weeks, horrifying images, videos have emerged of civilians, principally Alawites, appears there's also Christian victims and others, being massacred in cold blood by forces of the HTS, many of whom apparently are not even from Syria, places like Tajikistan or Xinjiang in China and so forth. And the situation appears to be spinning out of control, which was, entirely predictable, for a variety of reasons. What is your sense of the Trump administration's attitude to the deteriorating situation in Syria? I mean, obviously, I think it's quite obvious that they supported this Al Jilani character. They took the $10 million bounty off of his head. They appear to be treating him as the legitimate leader of Syria. But this is an extraordinarily explosive situation. Do you think they have any kind of a policy, whether it's ethical, legal, any kind of a coherent policy at all with dealing with this deteriorating situation? Or do you think that there's just kind of a drift when it comes to this horrifying set of circumstances in which the Syrian people now find themselves?
I think their policy is quite consistent. Their policy in Syria is consistent with their policy in the Gaza and the West Bank. These are white supremacists who couldn't care less about the lives of Palestinians or the lives of Syrians. And people need to understand that, in particular, people on the left who seem not to want to deal with the reality of how white supremacy is undermining the ability to mount effective opposition to these fascists. So no, the policies of the Trump administration is to allow for the Israelis to make the calls in Syria. This has been a gift to Israel, and as you said, it was entirely predictable. When those of us oppose the imposition of what they defined as a so-called civil war in Syria, and then got labeled as so-called Assadists, we oppose that because we can see what was going to happen if that intervention would have been successful. We saw that the U.S. administration under the Obama administration was dusting off their old playbook, reintroducing these jihadist elements as the military force to undermine the Assad government. And we knew that if the choice was between the continuation of Assad and a right wing fascist jihadist government put in place in Syria, what rational person would go with the jihadists? And so opposing this phony civil war seemed to be the only rational thing to do, despite whatever the contradictions were in the Assad government. But yet you had liberals aligning themselves with so-called leftists, giving and those leftists giving political cover and justification for this intervention. And those of us who were taking a peace position, if you will, rejecting this introduction or this introduction of an imperialist agenda in Syria, we were the ones condemned. So no, this is outrageous, and the very fact that it's not generating more international condemnation. And let me correct this. We keep on raising the question: why is the international community allowing what's happening in Gaza? Where is the world outcry in Gaza and now in Syria? I think that's incorrect. The majority of the world is in fact outraged about Gaza. They're outraged about what's happening in Syria. It is this 10% of the population of the U.S. and the so-called collective left, collective West, that has the ability to stop this, that they are the ones that have not moved. They are the ones that indicating and exposing the kind of moral corruption among their ruling elements that can allow this to happen. That could, even though it's undermining all of the structures and institutions put in place after the second imperialist war or World War II, exposing how backwards and ineffective those institutions are. They don't really care right now. And so we've got to put the onus where it really resides, and that is with the Western powers that are corrupting international morality, if you will, allowing for a genocide to continue in Gaza, and therefore not opposing what is a genocide developing now in Syria. This condemns the West.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, Ajamu, because I cringe every time I hear people say, "Where's the outrage?" I mean, there's no shortage of outrage in this world
Exactly.
about what is being done to the Palestinian people, and it's
Yes.
important that that's said. Now, the last
And
thing I want to
people are resisting, standing up. In particular, these young students, and both in the U.S., both the Democrats and now the Republicans have been united in their effort to suppress opposition in the U.S. among these young people. I mean, people have to be reminded that when the Democrats allow for these college presidents, university presidents to move against their students, these are their sons and daughters. They sacrifice, these are elite schools. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the same way they did during the Vietnam period in order to uphold U.S. and Israeli interests. And so this has to be, people have to be reminded of this, because this kind of moral corruption is irreversible. I tell people all the time, the West, anybody in the West should not be allowed to twist up their mouth and utter two terms: democracy and human rights. They have been condemned. They have been exposed. Human rights in their hands is phony. It's a mockery. Okay, and that's why we're moving to embrace a different conception of of human rights, a decolonized conception of human rights. Take it out of the hands of these Western imperialists. And democracy, what democracy? People talk about what Trump is undermining democracy in the U.S. When did we have democracy in the U.S.? Can you define democracy? We have an oligarchy. We have a dictatorship of capital. Same thing in Canada. So, we're clear about that.
Absolutely. So since we're on the subject of mockery, and this is where I'd like to conclude our discussion today, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, now has in detention the former president of Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, and he's been arrested to be prosecuted for murder as a crime against humanity in connection with his bloody war on drugs, which truly was an atrocious policy. And in an article published yesterday, Ajamu, the BBC described Duterte's arrest as a, quote, pivotal moment for the International Criminal Court. Now, I've seen some of your commentary about this, and I would like to give you an opportunity to respond to this notion that this is somehow a pivotal moment for the International Criminal Court.
Well, it may be a pivotal moment. That is, it is a moment that further solidifies the absolute hypocrisy of the court and of the West. The very fact that the BBC and others can herald this as something that's significant, while at the same time inviting a indicted Netanyahu to visit their capitals to honor him, is a glaring example of the kind of moral contradictions and moral bankruptcy of the West. This is outrageous. So the same way in which they were able to execute that arrest, and I'm not opposed to that at all. We're going to have international law and international standards. They need to be equally enforced. Okay, the same thing should be happening with not only with the current indicted felons, Netanyahu and Gallant, but the court didn't go far enough. There's no way you can indict Netanyahu and not indict Biden and Blinken. Okay, and so let's be honest. Basically, what this court did, what happened, was to kind of try to show up their loss of credibility. But in fact, it didn't do that. It just reinforced how backward and corrupt they really are. Here we have another third world president being swept off and taken off to The Hague. Okay, we're not impressed. Okay, when you are able to do the same thing with Netanyahu, if this genocide cranks back up again in Gaza, if you don't indict Trump for providing the material means to do that, then basically all you have done is just reinforce what you have exposed to the world. That basically these institutions and structures are no more than instruments for Western imperialism.
Right. And that is the antithesis of the rule of law. That is the antithesis of a court of justice. I could not agree more.
Exactly.
It's been a great pleasure speaking with you, Ajamu, and I hope that we can continue the conversation in future.
Yes, mine also. Appreciate it.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist.